Russia is the largest country on Earth. It spans 11 time zones, holds the world's largest nuclear arsenal, produced some of the greatest literature ever written, and right now is fighting the biggest war in Europe since 1945. But here's the question that Russian thinkers have been arguing about for 200 years and still haven't answered. Is Russia a European country that lost its way? Or is it a completely separate civilization that Europe never understood? How you answer that question changes everything, including how you think about what's happening in the world today. Start with geography, because in Russia's case, geography is destiny. The East European plain is an enormous flat space stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Urals, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. No natural barriers, no mountain ranges to stop an army, no seas to shield against invasion, just an endless plain you can march across in any direction. And from any direction, someone can march toward you. This explains one of the most consistent patterns in Russian history: the obsession with borders and buffer zones. A country with no natural defenses historically compensates in two ways: either by expanding until it reaches something impassable, or by building the strongest possible state internally. Ideally, both at once. In the 6th and 7th centuries AD, this plain is home to Slavic tribes. They live in forests and river valleys, farming and hunting, worshipping nature gods: Perun the thunder god, Veles the god of the underworld, Mokosh the goddess of fate. No unified state exists, just tribes: the Polans, Drevlians, Krivichs, Viatichs, Slovenians, dozens of groups, each with their own chiefs and customs. To the south, the steppe, through which waves of nomadic peoples pass: Huns, Avars, Khazars, Pechenegs, Cumans. Each new wave threatens the forest Slavs. This too is a constant: pressure from the east and south that doesn't stop for 1,000 years. To the north, the Varangians, Norse Vikings, who in the 8th and 9th centuries begin actively working the river routes of Eastern Europe. For them, it's a trade highway. Following the rivers south, you can reach Constantinople, the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Trading, raiding, establishing outposts, all happening simultaneously. And here comes one of the most debated stories in European history: 862 AD. According to the Primary Chronicle, the oldest Russian historical text, written by a monk named Nestor, around 1113, the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes of northern Eastern Europe approached the Varangians with an unusual request. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." A Varangian chieftain named Rurik arrives with his brothers and establishes himself in Novgorod. This is called the Calling of the Varangians, and it's one of the most politically charged episodes in Russian historiography. In the 18th century, German historians working for the Russian imperial court developed the Normanist theory. Scandinavians brought statehood to the Slavs. Russian nationalists fiercely disputed this. How could the great Russian state have been founded by outsiders? The truth, as always, is more complex. The process of state building was almost certainly already underway from within, and the Varangians played the role of military elite and trading partners, not civilizational creators from scratch. The blending of Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and Scandinavian elements is what eventually produces what we call Kievan Rus. The word Rus itself has disputed origins, possibly from the Finnish Ruotsi, what Finns called Swedes, possibly from a river name. Either way, it's not an ethnic label, but the name of a political entity. From this uncertain beginning, something remarkable is about to be built, and then, just as remarkably, destroyed. Rurik's descendants, the Rurikid dynasty, gradually extend their control southward along the river routes. The most important move, taking Kiev, a strategically located city on the Dnieper River that becomes the center of the new state. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus is a significant European power. It trades with Byzantium, the Arab world, and Scandinavia. Its cities, Kiev, Novgorod, Pskov, are major commercial centers. At its peak, Kiev has a population of around 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Two events define this era. First, 988 A.D. Prince Vladimir of Kiev makes a decision that will shape the next 1,000 years of Russian history. He chooses a religion. According to the chronicles, Vladimir sent envoys to observe the major faiths: Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, based in Constantinople. The story goes that when his envoys visited the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they reported, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it." How much of this is legend is debatable. What is certain is that Vladimir's political calculus was clear. Byzantium was the most powerful and sophisticated civilization in his neighborhood. Aligning with it through religion meant access to its culture, its trade networks, its prestige. Vladimir converts. Kievan Rus becomes Orthodox Christian. This single decision creates a permanent fork in the road between Russia and Western Europe. While the West aligns with Rome, the Latin Church, the Pope, eventually the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Russia aligns with Constantinople. Different alphabet, different theology, different relationship between church and state, different everything. This is the first major data point in the identity question. From 988 onward, Russia is Christian, but not the same kind of Christian as the West. Second defining event, the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, 1019 to 1054. Under him, Kievan Rus reaches its peak. He builds the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, deliberately echoing the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. He codifies law, the Russkaya Pravda, or Russian justice, one of the earliest Slavic legal codes. He establishes dynastic marriages with half of Europe. His daughters become queens of France, Hungary, and Norway. His sons marry into German and Byzantine royal families. At this moment, Kievan Rus is unambiguously part of the European world. It's connected, cosmopolitan, sophisticated. Then Yaroslav makes one fatal mistake. He divides his realm among his sons. The result is exactly what you'd expect. The sons fight. Their sons fight. Kiev weakens as power fragments into dozens of competing principalities. The city changes hands repeatedly. The political unity of Kievan Rus slowly dissolves. And while the princes are busy fighting each other, something is gathering on the horizon to the east that will end their world completely. In 1223, a Mongol scouting force appears at the edge of the steppe. The Russian princes defeat it at the Battle of the Sit River. They celebrate. They shouldn't have. 1237 Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, leads a Mongol army across the frozen Volga River in winter. What follows over the next 3 years reshapes Eastern Europe permanently. Ryazan falls. Vladimir falls. Kiev falls in 1240. The city that was the jewel of Slavic civilization is reduced to ruins. The Mongol army pushes west into Poland and Hungary before turning back. The numbers are staggering. Modern historians estimate that the Mongol invasion cost the lands of Kievan Rus between a third and half of their population to casualties, displacement, and famine. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction. Cities that existed before 1237 simply disappear from the record afterward. But here is where it gets historically complex and directly relevant to the identity question. The Mongols don't occupy Russia the way they occupied China or Persia. They establish the Golden Horde on the lower Volga and rule the Russian principalities as tribute-paying vassals. Russian princes must travel to the Horde's capital to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority, from the Khan. They must pay tribute. They must supply soldiers for Mongol campaigns. This arrangement lasts roughly 240 years, from 1240 to 1480, when Ivan III finally stops paying tribute. What did 240 years of Mongol overlordship do to Russia? Historians have debated this for centuries. The traditional Russian nationalist view, the Mongols were a catastrophe that cut Russia off from European development during exactly the period when the Renaissance and the growth of representative institutions were transforming the West. Russia missed the medieval flowering of European civic culture. The counter-argument: the Mongol influence was actually quite deep and formative. The Russian administrative system, the postal relay network, the taxation system, the military organization, all show strong Mongol influence. The very word denga, money in Old Russian, comes from the Mongol tenge. The word yam, postal station, giving us yamshchik, coachman, is Mongol. Tamozhnya, customs, is Mongol. Bashlik, kaftan, bazaar, all Mongol or Turkic words absorbed into Russian. More significantly, the principality that emerges as the dominant power after the Mongol period is Moscow, precisely because the Moscow princes were the most effective collaborators with the Golden Horde. Ivan Kalita. Kalita means money bag in Turkic, received from the Mongols the right to collect tribute from all Russian principalities and deliver it to the Horde. This gave Moscow resources no other principality had. Russia wasn't just damaged by the Mongols. It was partly shaped by them. This is the second major data point in the identity question. By the time Russia emerges from Mongol overlordship in the 15th century, it has spent 2.5 centuries developing separately from Western Europe. It has absorbed elements of a Central Asian political culture that emphasizes centralized authority, the subordination of individuals to the state, and the ruler's absolute power. Whether this is the cause of Russia's political culture or merely a contributing factor, that debate continues. What is not debatable? The state that emerges from the Mongol period looks very different from the Kievan Rus that preceded it, and it is led by a dynasty with very specific ideas about power. Ivan IV becomes Grand Prince of Moscow in 1533 at age 3. His mother rules as regent, then is likely removed from power by the boyar nobility. Ivan grows up watching the aristocracy fight over power around him, treating him alternately as a puppet and an irrelevance. In 1547, at age 16, he does something no Russian ruler had done before. He crowns himself Tsar, from the Latin Caesar, of all Russia. Not Grand Prince. Tsar. The word carries a deliberate message. Moscow is the heir of Rome, the heir of Byzantium, the third Rome. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Moscow is now the center of Orthodox Christian civilization. This idea, that Russia has a special historical mission, that it is the guardian of true Christianity against a corrupt West, is first fully articulated in Ivan's reign. A monk named Philotheus wrote to Ivan's grandfather, "Two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and a fourth there shall not be." The Third Rome Doctrine becomes a foundational element of Russian imperial ideology and echoes in secularized form in Russian political thinking to this day. Ivan's early reign is genuinely impressive. He convenes the first Zemsky Sobor, a consultative assembly of nobles, clergy, and townspeople, the closest Russia ever came to a representative institution in this period. He reforms the legal code. He conquers the Khanate of Kazan in 1552, the first major expansion eastward, celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. He begins trade relations with England through the newly discovered Northern Sea route. Then something changes. 1560. Ivan's wife Anastasia dies, possibly from natural causes, possibly from poisoning. Ivan becomes convinced the Boyars arranged her death. What follows is one of the most bizarre episodes in Russian history. In 1565, Ivan abruptly leaves Moscow and sends letters to the city, declaring that he is abdicating because of the treachery of the Boyars. The city panics. Delegations beg him to return. He agrees, on one condition. He must be given absolute power to deal with traitors as he sees fit, without interference from the church or the nobility. He returns and establishes the Oprichnina, a separate state within the state controlled entirely by Ivan, staffed by a new class of loyal servants called the Oprichniki, who dress in black, ride black horses, and carry a broom and a dog's head as symbols, sweeping away treachery, sniffing out enemies. What follows is years of terror. Families accused of disloyalty lose everything. The city of Novgorod, historically independent-minded, culturally connected to the West, is subjected to a campaign of violence lasting weeks. Thousands perish. Ivan personally oversees many of these proceedings. He is simultaneously composing sophisticated theological letters, debating with Protestant reformers, and ordering the elimination of people he considers enemies. He is intelligent, cultured, and terrifying, a combination that will recur in Russian history. In a fit of rage in 1581, he strikes his own son and heir with a staff, inadvertently causing his death. The image of Ivan cradling his dying son, immortalized in Ilya Repin's famous painting, captures the tragedy of a man who destroyed everything he loved through his own paranoia. Ivan dies in 1584, leaving behind an empire dramatically larger than the one he inherited, and a political culture thoroughly shaped by his methods. The lesson Ivan teaches Russian history: the Tsar's power is absolute. The state is everything. Individual rights, noble privilege, even family bonds are subordinate to the ruler's will. Those who serve loyally are rewarded. Those who don't disappear. This template will be repeated, with variations, for the next 4 centuries. But before Russia can fully consolidate this template, it faces a crisis that nearly destroys it entirely. Ivan's death begins a period Russians call the Smuta, the time of troubles. A succession crisis, famine, social upheaval, foreign invasion. Poland briefly occupies Moscow in 1610. The state nearly collapses entirely. In 1613, a Zemsky Sobor, that consultative assembly, elects a new czar, 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov. The Romanov dynasty will rule Russia for the next 304 years, until 1917. The early Romanovs stabilized the state. But the fundamental tension in Russian history, the tension between autocracy and reform, between Russia and Europe, between tradition and modernization, doesn't go away. It just waits. Until Peter I, Peter the Great, becomes sole ruler of Russia in 1696 at age 24. He is 6 feet 8 inches tall, physically enormous, intellectually voracious, and almost frighteningly energetic. He is also acutely aware of one fact: Russia is technologically and militarily far behind Western Europe. In 1697 to 1698, he does something no Russian czar has ever done. He travels to Western Europe incognito, the Grand Embassy, working as a carpenter in Dutch shipyards, visiting factories, hospitals, universities, and military installations. He is learning. He wants to understand exactly how Europe works, so he can transplant it into Russia. He returns and immediately begins transforming Russia. The reforms come in a flood. The nobility must shave their beards and wear Western clothes. Peter personally cuts the beards of his boyars at court. The Russian calendar is changed to align with Europe. A new capital, St. Petersburg, built on a swamp at the mouth of the Neva River, is constructed from scratch, designed by European architects to look like Amsterdam. It is Peter's statement in stone. Russia faces west. He creates a modern army and navy. He defeats Sweden in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, gaining access to the Baltic Sea, giving Russia its window to Europe. He restructures the government, replacing old Muscovite institutions with European-style ministries. He subordinates the Orthodox Church to the state, abolishing the Patriarchate and replacing it with a government-controlled Holy Synod. In 1721, he takes the title Emperor, the first Russian ruler to do so. Russia is now officially an empire, but here is the central paradox of Peter's reign, and the central paradox of Russian modernization that will repeat itself for the next 3 centuries. Peter westernizes Russia by using completely un-Western methods. His reforms are imposed by autocratic decree, enforced by secret police, funded by crushing taxation of the peasantry. There is no public debate. No representative assembly consults on the changes. Those who resist, including his own son Alexei, who opposes the reforms, face severe consequences. Alexei dies in prison in 1718 under circumstances that remain unclear. Peter wants Russia to have European technology, European science, European military power. He does not want European political culture, parliaments, individual rights, limits on royal authority. He wants the tools of the Enlightenment without the Enlightenment itself. This distinction, absorb Western technology while rejecting Western political values, will define Russian modernization attempts from Peter to Stalin to Putin. Peter dies in 1725, leaving behind a transformed state and an unresolved question. Can you have European modernity without European liberalism? Russia will spend the next 3 centuries trying to answer that question. After Peter, Russia goes through a period of palace coups and weak rulers. 6 rulers in 37 years. Then, in 1762, a German princess from a minor noble family stages a coup against her own husband, Tsar Peter III, and seizes power. Her name, when she arrived in Russia as a teenager, was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. She became Catherine II. History calls her Catherine the Great. She is one of the most remarkable rulers of the 18th century, anywhere in the world. She corresponds with Voltaire and Diderot. She founds the Hermitage Museum. She expands Russia dramatically, absorbing much of Poland, pushing the borders to the Black Sea, annexing Crimea in 1783 for the first time. She modernizes Russian law and administration. She considers herself an Enlightenment monarch. She writes a famous instruction, the Nakaz, for a legislative commission, drawing heavily on Montesquieu and Beccaria, discussing the rule of law, the limits of punishment, the rights of citizens. And then Pugachev's rebellion breaks out. Yemelyan Pugachev, a Don Cossack, leads a massive uprising from 1773 to 1775, claiming to be the legitimate Tsar Peter III. Hundreds of thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and ethnic minorities join him. They take cities, hang nobles, burn estates. It takes the imperial army more than a year to suppress it. Catherine's response is telling. She crushes the rebellion. She strengthens serfdom, binding peasants more tightly to the land and to their noble masters. She gives the nobility more power over their serfs. The Enlightenment ideals she corresponded about with French philosophers stay in the letters. The actual governance of Russia looks very different. This is the recurring pattern. Russian rulers engage with Western liberal ideas. They find them intellectually interesting. They do not implement them, because implementing them would mean limiting their own power. Catherine's other great legacy. She expands Russia's borders so dramatically that the empire now includes enormous numbers of non-Russian peoples: Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Germans, Tatars, and dozens of others. Managing this diversity will be one of the defining challenges of the Russian Empire until its end. And speaking of the end, it begins in a sense with the next great confrontation between Russia and the West. 1812. Napoleon invades Russia with the largest army ever assembled in European history, around 600,000 men. It is the supreme test of Russian power. Russia's response is counterintuitive. The army retreats. Moscow is abandoned and burns, likely set alight by Russians themselves to deny Napoleon winter quarters. Napoleon sits in the empty, burning city for 5 weeks, waiting for a peace offer that never comes. Then winter arrives. The Grande Armée begins its catastrophic retreat. Of the 600,000 who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 return. Napoleon's empire begins its collapse. Russia emerges from 1812 as the dominant land power in Europe. Russian troops march into Paris in 1814. Tsar Alexander I is the most powerful ruler in the Western world, but the officers who marched through Europe brought something back with them: ideas. They had seen France after the Revolution. They had seen constitutional monarchies. They had seen societies where the nobility had rights the government couldn't simply ignore. They came home and looked at Russia, with its serfs, its autocracy, its complete absence of any check on royal power, and found it wanting. December 1825. Alexander I dies unexpectedly. In the confused succession crisis that follows, a group of reform-minded officers stages an uprising in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution. The Decembrists, named for the month, are suppressed within hours by the new Tsar Nicholas I. 5 leaders are hanged. Hundreds are exiled to Siberia. The Decembrist uprising matters not because it succeeded, it failed completely, but because of what it represents. For the first time, a significant group of educated Russians openly argued that their country needed to fundamentally restructure itself along European liberal lines. And the state's response, immediate, total suppression, establishes the pattern that will repeat itself in 1905, 1917, 1991, and 2012. Nicholas I responds to the Decembrists by building the most systematic censorship and secret police apparatus Russia has seen. His motto, Orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality becomes the official ideology of the Russian state. Russia is not like Europe. Russia is better than Europe. European liberalism is dangerous. Russia's special path, its autocratic tradition, its orthodox faith, its national unity, is its strength, not its weakness. This debate, Westernizers versus Slavophiles, those who believed Russia should adopt European models versus those who believed Russia had its own unique path, defines Russian intellectual life for the entire 19th century. It is argued in novels, in philosophical journals, in censored pamphlets. Turgenev versus Dostoevsky, Herzen versus Pobedonostsev. The debate is never resolved, because it can't be resolved with words. It can only be resolved by what Russia actually becomes, and Russia keeps refusing to commit. The pressure for change keeps building. And when it finally explodes, it doesn't produce European liberalism, it produces something no one predicted. By the early 20th century, Russia is simultaneously one of the most powerful and most unstable states in the world. The Industrial Revolution is happening. St. Petersburg and Moscow are growing rapidly. Factories are multiplying. A new working class is forming. But the political system is still essentially the 17th century. An autocratic czar, with no meaningful parliament, an enormous peasant population only freed from serfdom in 1861, a nobility resistant to reform. Tsar Nicholas II is not a bad person. He is completely unsuited for the moment he inhabits. He genuinely believes in autocracy, not as a political choice, but as a religious duty. I shall maintain the principle of autocracy just as firmly and unflinchingly as it was preserved by my unforgettable dead father, he writes after taking the throne. 1905. Russia loses a war against Japan, the first time a European power is defeated by an Asian one in modern history. A revolution breaks out. Strikes, uprisings, the famous mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. Under pressure, Nicholas issues the October Manifesto, creating a Duma, a parliament, and promising civil liberties. Then he systematically undermines everything he promised. The Duma is weakened, its powers restricted. Civil liberties disappear. The reformist window closes. 1914. World War I. Russia mobilizes its enormous army and discovers that enormous armies require enormous industrial capacity to supply. Russia doesn't have it. The front collapses. By 1917, the army is disintegrating, the economy is in crisis, and the government has lost all credibility. February 1917. A revolution breaks out spontaneously. Nobody planned it. Nicholas abdicates. A provisional government takes power, promising democratic elections and continuing the war. 8 months later, Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government in October 1917 in a nearly bloodless coup. Lenin is the most consequential political figure of the 20th century, in terms of impact, arguably of any century. He combines a ruthless strategic intelligence with an absolute ideological certainty that produces one of the most radical political experiments in human history. His theory: capitalism must be replaced by socialism, and socialism can only be built through the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning the Communist Party rules on behalf of the working class, with no opposition permitted, no free press, no independent institutions. A civil war follows. The Reds versus the Whites, with foreign intervention on the white side. The Reds win by 1922. The Soviet Union is formally established. The communist experiment that follows is genuinely unprecedented. Private property is abolished. Religion is suppressed. The economy is centrally planned. art, literature, science, all subordinated to ideology. And those who resist, or are suspected of resisting, face the full force of the state. Lenin dies in 1924. A succession struggle follows. Joseph Stalin wins. Stalin is, in many ways, Ivan the Terrible taken to a 20th century extreme, with modern industrial technology and a totalitarian ideology at his disposal. The collectivization of agriculture in 1929 to 1933, forcing peasants onto collective farms, causes famine on a catastrophic scale. Ukraine, which resists collectivization most strongly, suffers the worst. The Holodomor kills millions. The exact numbers are disputed, but the minimum serious estimate is around 3.5 million in Ukraine alone. The Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. Stalin becomes convinced, or uses as a pretext, that the party, the military, and the state are riddled with enemies. What follows is a wave of arrests, show trials, and executions that decimates the Soviet elite. Around 750,000 people are executed. Millions more go to the Gulag, the network of labor camps that stretches across Siberia and the far north. The Red Army loses most of its senior officers just before the most devastating war in history. 1914. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. The initial months are catastrophic. The Red Army, still recovering from the terror, collapses. Germany advances hundreds of miles in weeks. By December, German forces are within sight of Moscow. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary reversals in military history. The Soviet Union absorbs losses that would have destroyed any other state. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens die in the war, military and civilian, and keeps fighting. The industrial capacity relocated east of the Urals, combined with American Lend-Lease supplies, gradually turns the tide. Stalingrad, 1942 to 43, is the turning point. By 1945, the Red Army is in Berlin. The victory in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War becomes the foundational myth of Soviet, and later Russian, national identity. Whatever else the Soviet system was, it won the most destructive war in human history. This achievement is genuinely staggering, and it provides a moral legitimacy that Russian rulers invoke to this day. Stalin dies in 1953. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, delivers a secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's crimes. A moment of extraordinary candor that destabilizes the entire Soviet bloc. The Hungarian Revolution breaks out. It is suppressed by Soviet tanks. The Cold War, that 40-year standoff between the American and Soviet systems, defines the second half of the 20th century. Two nuclear-armed superpowers compete across every domain: military, economic, ideological, cultural, athletic. The world divides into spheres of influence. Proxy wars are fought in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan. The Soviet system produces genuine achievements: the first satellite, the first human in space, mass literacy, free healthcare, superpower military status. It also produces chronic shortages, stagnation, and a political culture built on fear and conformity. By the 1980s, the gap between what the Soviet system promises and what it delivers is becoming impossible to ignore. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, and the most unexpected ending to a superpower in history. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. He is the first Soviet leader born after the revolution, genuinely post-Stalinist in his thinking. He believes the Soviet system can be reformed. He introduces two concepts that will undo everything: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost means allowing public discussion of problems the Soviet system had always denied. Suddenly, the media can report on crime, corruption, the Gulag, Stalin's crimes, the real costs of the Afghan war. The effect is destabilizing in ways Gorbachev doesn't anticipate. Perestroika means economic reform, trying to introduce elements of market competition into the centrally planned economy. It produces chaos without producing prosperity. And then, in 1986, Chernobyl. The explosion at the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and the Soviet government's initial attempts to cover it up, becomes a symbol of everything wrong with the system. The incompetence, the secrecy, the gap between official reality and actual reality. The satellite states of Eastern Europe begin to move. Poland holds free elections. Hungary opens its border with Austria. East Germans flood through. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Gorbachev does not send in the tanks. This is perhaps the most consequential decision of his career. He lets the Soviet bloc go. Inside the Soviet Union, the 15 republics begin declaring sovereignty. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, demand full independence. Ukraine, the second largest republic and the historical heartland of Kievan Rus, holds a referendum in December 1991. 90% vote for independence. December 25th, 1991. Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet flag over the Kremlin is lowered. The Russian tricolor goes up. The Soviet Union, 74 years after its founding, ceases to exist. It ends not with a military defeat, not with foreign invasion, but from within, under the weight of its own contradictions. For Russians, this is not simply the end of a political system. It is the collapse of a civilization they inhabited. Millions of Russians find themselves living in newly independent foreign countries, 14 new states, where Russians are suddenly minorities. The economy collapses. Life expectancy drops. The social safety net disappears. In the 1990s, a small group of well-connected insiders acquire the assets of the entire Soviet economy for almost nothing: the oligarchs. This experience, the chaos, humiliation, and loss of the 1990s, is the essential context for everything that comes next. Because from this wreckage emerges a man who has a very specific answer to the question of what Russia should be. Vladimir Putin is a product of the KGB, the Soviet secret police. He served in East Germany during the Cold War and watched the Soviet bloc collapse from Dresden. By his own account, when he tried to call Moscow for instructions, as crowds surrounded the KGB building in Dresden in 1989, no one answered. Moscow is silent, he was told. He joins the administration of St. Petersburg's first Democratic mayor in the early 1990s, then moves to Moscow and rises rapidly through the Yeltsin government. In 1998, he becomes head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB. In 1999, Yeltsin appoints him prime minister. On December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin resigns and Putin becomes acting president. He wins the 2000 election easily. Russia is exhausted and humiliated. Putin offers stability, order, and a restoration of national pride. His first term coincides with rapidly rising oil prices. Russia's economy grows, incomes rise, the chaos of the 1990s recedes. Putin's approval ratings are genuinely high, reflecting genuine public satisfaction. He is not simply a dictator imposing himself on an unwilling population, at least not initially. But alongside the economic recovery comes a systematic consolidation of power. Independent television channels are taken over or shut down. Oligarchs who support opposition politics lose their businesses and sometimes their freedom. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, spends 10 years in prison. Regional governors, previously elected, are now appointed by the Kremlin. The parliament becomes a rubber stamp. The Chechen Wars, the first, 1994 to 96, ended in Russian defeat. The second, 1999 to 2009, is prosecuted with overwhelming force. Establish the template. Any challenge to Russian territorial integrity will be met with maximum force. In 2008, Russia goes to war with Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The war lasts 5 days. Russian troops advance to within 40 miles of Tbilisi. The West protests. Nothing changes. In 2014, after a popular revolution in Ukraine overthrows the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, Russia annexes Crimea and supports separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. The reaction from the West, sanctions, condemnation, does not reverse the annexation. In February 2022, Russia launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest military operation in Europe since World War II. Putin's stated justifications are multiple and shift over time. Ukraine is not a real country. NATO expansion threatens Russia. Russian speakers in Ukraine need protection. Ukraine is controlled by Nazis. None of these justifications hold up to scrutiny as presented. But they point to something deeper in Putin's worldview. In a long essay published in 2021, Putin argues that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that the separation of Ukraine from Russia is an artificial product of Soviet nationalities policy and Western interference. He frames the war not as an invasion of a foreign country, but as a reunification of a divided nation. This is where the historical thread becomes direct. Putin's thinking connects explicitly to the Third Rome ideology of Ivan the Terrible's era, to the idea of Russia as a unique civilization with its own rules and its own historical destiny, to the rejection of Western liberal norms as alien impositions rather than universal values. The identity question, is Russia European or something else, has, under Putin, received a definitive answer from the Russian state: something else. Russia is not a European country that took a wrong turn. It is a separate civilization with its own values, its own history, its own rules, and its own sphere of influence that the West must respect. Whether that answer reflects the views of Russian society as a whole is a different question. Significant polling before full censorship was imposed suggested that younger Russians, urban Russians, educated Russians were significantly more pro-Western in their orientations than the official position suggests. But under current conditions, with independent media shut down, anti-war protest criminalized, and the information environment tightly controlled, it is genuinely difficult to know what Russians think. What is clear is that the pattern identified throughout this history has reasserted itself. An autocratic state, suspicious of the West, expanding its borders when it perceives weakness, suppressing internal dissent, and framing all of this in the language of unique Russian destiny. Russia's history is, in one reading, a tragedy of missed opportunities. Every time a reformist window opened, the Zemsky Sobor under Ivan, the constitutional moment after the Decembrists, the Duma after 1905, the provisional government of 1917, Gorbachev's glasnost. It was closed again. Every time a reformist window opened, the Zemsky Sobor under Ivan, the constitutional moment after the Decembrists, the Duma after 1905, the provisional government of 1917, Gorbachev's glasnost. It was closed again. Not always by force, sometimes by the reformers' own failures, sometimes by external shocks, sometimes by the weight of institutional inertia. Not always by force, sometimes by the reformers' own failures, sometimes by external shocks, sometimes by the weight of institutional inertia. In another reading, it is not a tragedy at all, but a coherent story of a civilization that genuinely is different from the West, that has different values around the relationship between individual and state, different historical memories, different geographical imperatives, and that keeps being misunderstood by outsiders who expect it to eventually become European. In another reading, it is not a tragedy at all, but a coherent story of a civilization that genuinely is different from the West, that has different values around the relationship between individual and state, different historical memories, different geographical imperatives, and that keeps being misunderstood by outsiders who expect it to eventually become European. Both readings contain truth, and neither resolves the central question. What Russia has given the world is undeniable. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich. The periodic table, the first human in space, chess grandmasters, mathematical traditions of extraordinary depth. What Russia has given the world is undeniable. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich, the periodic table, the first human in space, chess grandmasters, mathematical traditions of extraordinary depth. What Russia has given the world is undeniable. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich, the periodic table, the first human in space, chess grandmasters, mathematical traditions of extraordinary depth. A culture of remarkable richness produced by a society under extraordinary pressure. What Russia's political culture has produced? The autocracy cycle, the secret police, the suppression of civil society, the wars, is also undeniable. What Russia's political culture has produced? The autocracy cycle, the secret police, the suppression of civil society, the wars, is also undeniable. The question that Russian thinkers have argued about since Pushkin is still open. Can those two things be separated? Can Russia have the culture without the autocracy? Can it find a political form that preserves what is genuinely its own, while making room for what its own people, especially its young, urban, educated people, increasingly want? History doesn't guarantee answers, but it does establish baselines. Every previous version of Russian autocracy ended. Ivan's Oprichnina, the Romanov dynasty, the Soviet Union. None of them ended quickly. All of them left deep marks on what came after. The current chapter is still being written,